Hi. So this is Celestial, a card game web app, and I've implemented user sign-in using OAuth. And I'm going to transition that out for a number of months, but I just wanted to note quickly how it's set up. I guess loosely, if you're interested in building something similar, maybe this is useful to you. And for my own purposes, to look back on, this code will still be available to me because of version control, but getting the correct setup is kind of hard. So I'm using DigitalOcean as a platform. The three I guess, nodes to consider are client-side code, server-side code, and a database. And so on this client website, you'll notice that there's Google OAuth. And so that's implemented using, first going over, in the preload scene, it renders a sign-in button, and that has an on success and on failure. So just using Google's API, you click this button, it shows you all of your logged in Google accounts, and if you click on one of them, it will say, do you want to give it such and such permissions? I've already done that, so I don't think that it says that for me, or maybe it does. To continue, Google will share your name, email address, language preference, and profile picture. So you can set exactly how much permission is being given in a number of different ways. But how I've set it up, I forget which Google website I do that on. It's just giving very basic information because I just want to see that they have an account. So if it's successful, it takes an ID token, and you probably need to look into, there's some really good videos on this, but you need to look into how the tokens work for all OAuth situations. So this is preload scene, and then there's also server scene. So login passes that token, and it's going to send this to my server side Python. It's opening a WebSocket, so there's some persistent connection. Ostensibly, this is for if you have an account and you can like chat with your friends, or you can use the store using that same WebSocket connection. The way the game works is you can play without an account, but it's sort of only preserved on your computer, and if you delete local storage, like you don't get to keep the decks you've made and the progress that you've made. This incentivizes you to make an account, and then you can also play it across different devices. But essentially this is sending to the server the token that we got back. Now that code is in Python. WebSockets are handled in a different place, but then the WebSocket is passed through to this authenticate function. It is going to check with Google's API that that's a valid token. I think on their back end, if it needs to, that ends up getting refreshed. And then this accesses the database. So where does that happen? Send token, get ID, email. So each Google account has a unique universal ID that gets passed back, and that is the key that our database logs these accounts with. And then get user ID sends to the database this unique ID, an email. I think this is only used for the first time you're setting it up. And that's, I guess, more so just for debugging purposes. You don't actually have to keep the email. The UUID is enough. But if someone's like, hey, my account's broken, or bad transaction or something, they don't know their unique user ID. They do know their email. And then this is sent back to the client, their user data. And when it hears that sort of connection, it loads that user data. So that sets things like saying, okay, now I'm logged in. I have, these different missions completed. I have such and such amount of money. It loads all the decks, that sort of thing. And it also boots them back to this main screen, because you'd end up with weird behavior if you're in the middle of a match and then you decided to log in and maybe you got match made without like an MMR, but then when you win, it goes to your account. Like, that's a whole world of weird possibilities. Currently, the UIUX isn't perfect, so you can kind of sign in. You can see this button from anywhere. I think ideally you would only be able to see it from this screen, and there would be more options for what platforms you can authenticate with. And I guess the last thing to show, so this is how you authenticate and log in. And then it can also adjust user data. Okay, so one interesting thing, I implemented packs very similar to Gwent, which is a card game. So when you open a pack, the server rolls randomly 5 cards that you have. And then the 5th of those cards, you have 3 different options for which you want to pick. Gives the user some control. But what happens if the user opens a pack but then exits? It should automatically choose one of those, and there should never be any way to abuse the system. So how this does it is it randomly rolls 5 cards, sends those choices to the user, and assumes that they picked the first one. And then for their connection also holds on and says, okay, I just gave you such and such a card, but you might choose something else. And then if they pick either the second or the third card, it takes one of those away, takes away the card that it gave with a bad prediction that they would choose that one, and instead gives them one of the other ones. And this model of collection growing isn't what's going to get used in this game, but that is sort of how you can more safely implement something like the standards of today in Gwent or Legends of Runeterra, or I think Hearthstone doesn't do this, but those games. So the very last thing is that after winning a match, for example, it updates how many wins the user has and how much currency the user has. And so you can see I've logged into the database that's hosted on DigitalOcean. And if you want to implement something like this, there are other considerations. So I use a secret local variable that's a part of DigitalOcean's setup for logging into this database. So that's not stored in any of my code. And it's kind of easy to change through their platform. But these are the different fields in the database, and there are some default values. These are like the starting decks, although that will probably change. These are probably going to change. But yeah, I think eventually something very similar will be implemented. It's just that at the moment, having this setup costs around $60 a month, and it's not going to be useful or put in use for several months. So I'm going to take it down, and presumably we'll be able to put something similar back up. It will be a good test of comprehension if I'm able to do so with no struggling. Thanks. This has been implementing OAuth user sign-in for a web app. My name is Kai, and this is my game that's being developed.